At 2:15 in the afternoon on January 30th, 1945, Helga Reuter pushed through the crowd on the dock at Gotenhafen and stepped onto the gangway leading up to the Wilhelm Gustloff. She was 24 years old, a naval auxiliary who had spent the last 6 months operating radio equipment at a Kriegsmarine communications station near Danzig. She carried one small suitcase containing everything she owned. Behind her, thousands of other refugees pressed forward, desperate to board. The temperature was 12 degrees below 0 Celsius. Snow fell steadily from a gray sky. The Wilhelm Gustloff sat low in the water at the pier, a passenger liner 684 feet long, painted in military gray, designed to carry 1,900 passengers, but today loading more than 10,000. Reuter climbed the gangway, showed her papers to a harassed crew member who barely glanced at them, and pushed into the crowded interior of the ship. She did not know that in exactly 7 hours, this vessel would be at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. She did not know that she would be one of approximately 1,200 survivors out of more than 10,000 passengers. She did not know that she was boarding the site of the greatest maritime disaster in human history. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been built in Hamburg in 1937 and launched in May 1938. The ship was named after Wilhelm Gustloff, a Nazi Party official in Switzerland who had been assassinated by a Jewish student in February 1936. The assassination had been a propaganda gift to the Nazi regime, which turned Gustloff into a martyr. The ship bearing his name was intended as a symbol of National Socialist achievement, built for the Kraft durch Freude organization, Strength Through Joy, which provided subsidized leisure activities for German workers. The KDF operated cruise ships that took German workers on Mediterranean tours and Norwegian fjord excursions, demonstrating the benefits the Nazi regime provided to ordinary citizens. The Wilhelm Gustloff was the flagship of this fleet, equipped with swimming pools, ballrooms, dining halls, medical facilities, and accommodations for 1,900 passengers in comfort. The ship cost 25 million Reichsmarks to build and was designed to showcase German engineering and Nazi ideology simultaneously. That ideological purpose ended when the war started in September 1939. The Kriegsmarine requisitioned the Wilhelm Gustloff immediately and converted it to military use. The swimming pools were drained. The ballrooms became barracks. The comfortable staterooms were gutted and replaced with bunks stacked 4 high. The ship served initially as a hospital ship, then as a barracks for naval personnel, then as a submarine tender. By January 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff was assigned to Operation Hannibal, the massive evacuation of German military personnel and civilians from territories in the east before Soviet forces arrived. Operation Hannibal would become the largest naval evacuation in history, eventually moving over 2 million people westward by sea between January and May 1945. The evacuation was necessary because the Soviet offensive that began on January 12th had shattered German defensive lines in East Prussia and was advancing rapidly toward the Baltic coast. German civilians in East Prussia, Danzig, and other eastern territories faced a choice between fleeing westward or remaining to face Soviet occupation. Stories of Soviet atrocities against German civilians had spread panic across the region. Many of these stories were exaggerated by Nazi propaganda, but many were true. Soviet soldiers had witnessed 4 years of German atrocities in the Soviet Union and were seeking revenge. The Red Army advancing into German territory in January 1945 was not restrained by officers enforcing discipline. Rape, murder, and looting were common. German civilians who could flee did so. Those who could not faced uncertain fates. The refugees boarding the Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30th came from all across the eastern territories. Most were women and children. The men were either in military service, dead, or already captured. There were mothers carrying infants. elderly couples who had lived their entire lives in East Prussia and were now refugees, teenage girls who worked as auxiliaries for the Wehrmacht or Kriegsmarine, wounded soldiers being evacuated from field hospitals, submarine trainees from the naval training school at Gotenhafen. Every person boarding had a story of loss, homes abandoned, possessions left behind, family members missing or dead. They carried small bags containing whatever they could save: photographs, documents, a few items of clothing. Nothing heavy, nothing unnecessary. They had walked for days through snow and cold to reach Gotenhafen. They had waited on the docks for hours, sometimes days, hoping for space on an evacuation ship. When the Wilhelm Gustloff opened for boarding on the morning of January 30th, the crowd surged forward. Everyone wanted aboard. Everyone understood that this might be the last ship leaving before Soviet forces reached the port. The ship's captain was a 43-year-old merchant marine officer named Friedrich Petersen. He had commanded passenger vessels his entire career and had been captain of the Wilhelm Gustloff since 1943, when the ship was serving as a submarine tender. Petersen was not a military officer. He was a civilian merchant captain working under Kriegsmarine authority. His orders for January 30th were straightforward: load as many refugees and military personnel as possible and transport them to Kiel in western Germany. The voyage should take approximately 30 hours if weather and sea conditions were favorable. Petersen knew the risks. Soviet submarines were active in the Baltic. Several German ships had been sunk in recent weeks, but there was no alternative. The refugees had to be evacuated. The ship had to sail. The loading continued through the afternoon. The crew tried to maintain order, but the crowd was beyond control. People pushed onto gangways, climbed over railings, forced their way through doors. The ship's manifest, which was supposed to record every passenger, became meaningless. There were too many people boarding too quickly. The crew stopped trying to count. They simply directed people below decks and tried to prevent dangerous overcrowding on the upper levels. By 4 in the afternoon, the ship's interior spaces were packed solid. Every bunk was full. Every corridor was crowded. Every compartment held more people than it was designed for. And still the refugees kept boarding. The ship, designed for 1,900 passengers, now held approximately 6,000 civilians. In addition, there were approximately 900 wounded soldiers being evacuated from military hospitals, approximately 370 female naval auxiliaries from the Women's Naval Auxiliary Service, approximately 162 crew members, and approximately 373 male naval personnel, including submarine trainees and officers. The exact numbers would never be known precisely because record-keeping collapsed under the chaos. Post-war estimates based on survivor testimony and partial records suggest the Wilhelm Gustloff departed Gotenhafen with between 10,400 and 10,600 people aboard. That number made it one of the most crowded passenger vessels ever to put to sea. Helga Reuter found space in a corridor on the lower deck. She sat on the floor with her back against a bulkhead and her suitcase on her lap. Around her were dozens of other women and children, all sitting or standing in whatever space they could find. The air was warm from body heat. The smell of unwashed people and fear was overwhelming. Reuter closed her eyes and tried to rest. She had been awake for over 30 hours, first evacuating from her duty station near Danzig, then traveling by truck and train to Gotenhafen, then waiting on the freezing dock for the ship to begin boarding. She was exhausted. She wanted to sleep, but the noise and crowding made that impossible. Children were crying. Women were talking in worried voices. Somewhere down the corridor, a baby was screaming. Reuter opened her eyes and looked around. Every face she saw showed the same expression: exhaustion, fear, and desperate hope. These people had lost everything. Their homes were behind enemy lines. Their relatives were scattered or dead. Their lives had been destroyed by a war they had not started. All they wanted now was to survive, to reach Western Germany, to find safety. The Wilhelm Gustloff was their last chance. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, as the Wilhelm Gustloff was still loading passengers, a Soviet submarine designated S-13 was approximately 30 nautical miles northwest of Gotenhafen, cruising submerged at periscope depth. The submarine was a Series 9 bis vessel, 256 feet long, displacing 842 tons surfaced, capable of making 15 knots on the surface and 8 knots submerged. The submarine carried 12 torpedoes, 6 loaded in the forward tubes and 6 in reserve. The crew numbered 50 men. The captain was a 32-year-old officer named Alexander Marinesco. He was an experienced submariner who had been commanding S-13 since 1943. Marinesco was an effective combat officer, but also a disciplinary problem. He had been reprimanded multiple times for drunkenness and insubordination. In October 1944, he had gone absent without leave for several days while his submarine was in port, reportedly spending the time drunk in a brothel. Soviet Naval Command had considered relieving him of command, but decided his combat effectiveness was valuable enough to overlook his personal conduct problems. By January 1945, Marinesco had sunk several German merchant vessels, but had not yet achieved a major kill against a significant target. He was under pressure to prove himself. S-13 had departed from its base at Turku, Finland on January 11th for a patrol in the Baltic Sea. The submarine's orders were to attack German shipping, moving between German-held ports. Soviet naval intelligence knew that Germany was conducting a massive evacuation by sea. Every ship carrying Germans westward was considered a legitimate military target. International maritime law in 1945 theoretically required submarines to warn passenger vessels before attacking them, allowing time for evacuation. But total war had made those rules meaningless. Germany had not warned Soviet ships before attacking them. Soviet submarines would not warn German ships. At approximately 1:45 in the afternoon on January 30th, S-13's sonar operator detected faint propeller sounds to the south. Marinesco ordered the submarine to periscope depth and turned toward the contact. Through the periscope in the gray afternoon light, Marinesco could see nothing clearly. Visibility was poor. Snow was falling. But the sonar contact was strong and consistent, a large vessel moving westward at moderate speed. Marinesco tracked the contact for several hours, maintaining a parallel course, staying submerged, keeping the target on sonar. He did not know what kind of ship it was. He did not know how many people were aboard. He knew only that it was a large German vessel, and therefore a legitimate target. At 12:40 in the afternoon, Captain Peterson gave the order to cast off. The Wilhelm Gustloff's lines were released from the dock. The ship moved slowly away from the pier, maneuvering carefully through ice floes that clogged Gotenhafen harbor. Once clear of the harbor entrance, Peterson turned the ship northwest and increased speed to 15 knots. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not sailing alone. 2 torpedo boats, the Löwe and the T-196, had been assigned as escorts, but both vessels developed mechanical problems before departure. The Löwe's steering system failed. The T-196 had engine trouble. Peterson waited for approximately 1 hour for the escorts to resolve their problems. By 2 in the afternoon, only the Löwe had become operational. Captain Peterson made a decision. He would sail with 1 escort rather than wait longer. Every hour of delay increased the risk that Soviet forces would reach Gotenhafen. The Wilhelm Gustloff and the Löwe departed at 12:45 and headed northwest into the Baltic. The original route plan called for the Wilhelm Gustloff to stay close to the coast in shallow water, where submarines were less likely to operate. Submarines prefer deep water, where they can dive deep if threatened. Shallow coastal waters limit submarine maneuverability and make them vulnerable to running aground. But staying close to the coast meant traveling through areas where Germany had laid extensive minefields to protect against Soviet naval forces. Captain Peterson faced a choice: risk mines by staying coastal, or risk submarines by moving into deeper water. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Peterson received a radio message from German Naval Command informing him that a minesweeper convoy had recently cleared a channel through deeper waters further offshore. The message recommended using this channel to avoid minefields. Peterson discussed the options with his officers. The consensus was that mines were a more immediate danger than submarines. Submarines could be evaded. Mines could not. Peterson gave the order to turn north away from the coast and head for the cleared channel in deeper water. It was a reasonable decision based on available information. It was also a fatal mistake. By moving into deeper water, the Wilhelm Gustloff was sailing directly into waters where S-13 was patrolling. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, S-13 sonar operator reported that the contact's course had changed. The target was now heading north, away from the coast, moving into deeper water. Marinesco saw an opportunity. In deeper water, he would have more room to maneuver. He could approach closer without risking running aground. He could set up a better attack position. He ordered S-13 to increase speed and close the distance to the target. By 6 in the evening, S-13 was approximately 5 nautical miles from the Wilhelm Gustloff, following on a parallel course. Marinesco could now see the target more clearly through the periscope. It was definitely a large passenger ship, painted in military colors, traveling with one small escort vessel. The ship was not zigzagging, which would have made a submarine attack more difficult. It was maintaining a steady course at constant speed. That made targeting calculations much simpler. Aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, most passengers were unaware of the danger. Below decks, Helga Reuter and thousands of others sat in crowded compartments, waiting for the voyage to end. Some tried to sleep. Others talked quietly. Children played in the corridors. The wounded soldiers lay on stretchers, some conscious, some sedated. The submarine trainees gathered in groups, young men aged 17 to 20, discussing what assignments they might receive when they reached Kiel. Nobody knew that approximately 5 miles behind them, a Soviet submarine was preparing to attack. At approximately 7 in the evening, Soviet sonar detected another vessel approaching from the west. It was a German minesweeper returning to Gotenhafen after completing its patrol. The minesweeper passed the Wilhelm Gustloff, heading in the opposite direction. Standard procedure required all German vessels to maintain blackout conditions at night, showing no lights that might help enemy forces target them. But the minesweeper's captain made an error. As his vessel passed the Wilhelm Gustloff, someone on the minesweeper turned on navigation lights briefly, possibly to identify themselves to the larger ship and avoid collision. The lights were visible for only a few minutes, but those few minutes were enough. Aboard S-13, Marinesco saw the lights and realized the target was a large German ship with escort vessels. He now knew he was tracking a significant target, possibly a military transport carrying troops or equipment. He ordered his crew to battle stations and began final preparations for attack. At 9:04 in the evening, the Wilhelm Gustloff was approximately 30 nautical miles from the coast, in water approximately 150 feet deep, traveling at 15 knots on a northwest heading. The night was dark. Overcast skies blocked any moonlight. The temperature was -12 Celsius. The sea state was moderate, with waves 3 to 4 feet high. Most passengers below decks had settled in for the night. Children were sleeping. Adults were trying to rest. The crew maintained watch positions. Captain Peterson was in his cabin. The officer of the watch was on the bridge. Everything seemed routine. Nobody aboard suspected that 5 miles astern, a Soviet submarine was maneuvering into attack position. At 9:06, Marinesco gave the order to fire. S-13 was approximately 3,000 meters from the Wilhelm Gustloff, positioned on the target's port quarter. The submarine was at periscope depth, moving slowly, maintaining a stable firing platform. The forward torpedo tubes were loaded with Type 53-39 torpedoes, each one weighing approximately 800 kilograms, with a warhead containing 300 kilograms of TNT. The torpedoes were set to run at a depth of 3 meters, shallow enough to strike the target below the waterline, but above the keel. Marinesco had calculated a firing solution based on the target's course, speed, and distance. He would fire 3 torpedoes in a spread pattern. If the calculations were correct, at least 1 torpedo should hit. Probably more. At 9:08, the first torpedo left the tube. 15 seconds later, the second torpedo fired. 15 seconds after that, the third torpedo launched. The torpedoes accelerated to approximately 44 knots and ran toward the Wilhelm Gustloff. The range was close enough that the time to impact would be less than 2 minutes. Aboard S-13, the crew waited silently, listening on passive sonar, counting the seconds, waiting for the sound of explosions that would indicate successful hits. Marinesco watched through the periscope, though visibility was poor in the darkness. He could see the dim silhouette of the target, but not enough detail to observe the torpedo strikes. He would have to rely on sound. At 9:16 and 48 seconds, the first torpedo struck the Wilhelm Gustloff on the port side forward, approximately 30 meters behind the bow. The explosion occurred in the area where the ship's swimming pool had been located. The pool had been drained years earlier, and the space converted to quarters for female naval auxiliaries. At the moment of impact, approximately 370 women were in that compartment, sleeping in bunks or preparing for bed. The torpedo's 300-kilogram warhead detonated against the ship's hull. The explosion tore a hole approximately 10 meters wide in the ship's side. The swimming pool compartment was below the waterline. When the hull ruptured, the Baltic Sea poured in at enormous pressure. The compartment flooded in less than 2 minutes. The women inside had no chance. Most were killed instantly by the explosion. Those who survived the blast drowned in the flooding compartment. The water was -2 degrees Celsius. The few who made it to the corridor outside the compartment were already hypothermic. Within 5 minutes, everyone in that section was dead. 370 women. Naval auxiliaries who operated radios and telephones and administrative equipment. Women aged 18 to 28. Women who had volunteered to serve the Kriegsmarine. Women who were fleeing westward like everyone else aboard. All dead in the first 2 minutes after the torpedo struck. 18 seconds after the first explosion, the second torpedo struck amidships on the port side, hitting in the area of the former dining hall. This compartment had been converted to a medical ward holding approximately 400 wounded soldiers on stretchers. The explosion killed most of them instantly. Those who survived were trapped as water flooded through the ruptured hull. The wounded could not move. They could not climb. They could not save themselves. They drowned on their stretchers, unable to escape, conscious and aware as the freezing water rose over them. Within 5 minutes, all 400 were dead. 22 seconds after the second explosion, the third torpedo struck aft, in the area of the engine room. The explosion destroyed the ship's propulsion machinery and severed all electrical power. The Wilhelm Gustloff went dark. Every light in the ship died simultaneously. The engines stopped. The ventilation stopped. The heating stopped. 10,000 people were suddenly in complete darkness, feeling the ship shudder from explosions, hearing the sound of tearing metal and rushing water. Panic began immediately. The Wilhelm Gustloff began listing to port within seconds of the torpedo strikes. Water was pouring into 3 separate compartments. The ship's watertight doors closed automatically, but the damage was too extensive. The list increased from 5 degrees to 10 degrees to 15 degrees in the first 2 minutes. In the crowded compartments below decks, Passengers were thrown against bulkheads. Children were separated from mothers. People fell. In the darkness, nobody could see. They could only hear screaming and feel the ship tilting under them. Helga Reuter had been sitting in a corridor on the lower deck when the first torpedo hit. The explosion threw her against a bulkhead. In the sudden darkness, she heard screaming from all directions. She could feel the ship listing. She knew immediately what had happened. Submarine attack. She had been trained as a naval auxiliary. She understood what torpedo strikes meant. She had perhaps 30 minutes before the ship sank. She needed to reach the open deck. She stood up in the darkness and began pushing toward where she remembered the stairway was. Around her, hundreds of other people were doing the same thing. Everyone was moving in the same direction. Everyone was trying to reach the stairs. The crush became terrible. People were pushed from behind. People fell and were trampled. In the darkness, nobody could see who they were stepping on. Reuter reached the base of the stairway and began climbing. Each step was crowded with people. She pushed upward, using her hands on the walls to guide herself, stepping on things she tried not to think about. The stairs were tilted because the ship was listing. Climbing was difficult. Behind her, she could hear water rushing. The lower decks were flooding. On the upper decks, the situation was only slightly better. The ship's crew had been trained for emergency situations, but nothing had prepared them for this. 10,000 passengers. 3 torpedo strikes. Power failure. List increasing. No possibility of successful evacuation. The lifeboats were on davits along the ship's sides. In theory, they could be launched. In practice, the list made launching nearly impossible. On the port side, where the ship was tilting downward, the lifeboats swung inward, pressed against the ship's hull. They could not be moved. On the starboard side, where the ship was tilting upward, the lifeboats swung outward, away from the ship. They hung over empty air. People could not board them safely. The crew tried to launch boats anyway. Some succeeded. Most did not. Of the 22 lifeboats aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, approximately 9 were launched successfully. Each boat was designed to carry 60 people. That meant maximum capacity of 540 people in the lifeboats. There were over 10,000 people aboard. At 9:25, 9 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the ship's list reached 30 degrees. Walking on the deck was nearly impossible. People slid toward the port rail. Some went over into the water. Others grabbed onto anything they could reach and held on. The temperature was -12 Celsius. The water was -2. Anyone entering the water without a life jacket would die within 15 minutes. Anyone entering the water, even with a life jacket, would die within 30 minutes unless rescued immediately. There were not enough life jackets. The ship had carried insufficient safety equipment for even its designed capacity of 1,900 passengers. With over 10,000 aboard, less than 20% had access to life-preserving equipment. The German torpedo boat Löwe, which had been escorting the Wilhelm Gustloff, responded immediately to the attack. The Löwe's captain saw the explosions and turned his vessel toward the stricken ship. But the Löwe was a small vessel, designed for anti-submarine warfare, not rescue operations. It could take aboard perhaps 200 people maximum before becoming dangerously overloaded. As the Löwe approached the Wilhelm Gustloff, its crew could see people jumping from the sinking ship. They could hear screaming from thousands of voices. They could see the massive vessel tilting further with each passing minute. The Löwe's captain made a difficult decision. He would not bring his vessel alongside the Wilhelm Gustloff. Doing so would risk the Löwe being pulled down if the larger ship capsized suddenly. Instead, the Löwe would search for survivors in the water and pick up as many as possible. It was a rational decision. It was also a death sentence for most people still aboard the sinking ship. At 9:38, 22 minutes after the first torpedo strike, The Wilhelm Gustloff's list exceeded 45 degrees. The ship was now almost on its side. The port rail was under water. The starboard rail pointed at the sky. People still on deck had three choices. Jump into the water now, climb toward the starboard rail and hope to find something to hold on to, or go back inside and wait to drown. Hundreds chose to jump. They leaped from the tilting deck into the freezing Baltic. Most had no life jackets. They hit the water and started swimming away from the ship, trying to avoid being pulled under when it sank. The water was so cold, it stopped their hearts within minutes. The few who were wearing life jackets floated, but lost consciousness from hypothermia within 15 minutes. Dead bodies began accumulating on the surface. Hundreds. Then, thousands. Helga Reuter reached the open deck at approximately 9:30. She had climbed 5 flights of stairs in total darkness, pushed through corridors packed with panicking people, and emerged onto a deck tilted at 40 degrees. All around her, people were screaming. Some were jumping. Others were clinging to railings. Reuter looked for a lifeboat. She saw one approximately 20 meters away, hanging from its davits, already holding over 100 people. She started moving toward it, half climbing, half crawling across the tilted deck. She reached the lifeboat. People were trying to get in. There was no room. Someone pulled her arm. A crew member. He pushed her toward the boat. She climbed over the rail and fell into the mass of people already inside. The boat was so overloaded it was nearly capsizing. Someone started lowering it using the manual davit cranks. The boat descended jerkily. People in the water below reached up toward it. The boat hit the water. Immediately, dozens of people tried to climb aboard. The boat began taking on water. People were pushing others off to keep the boat from swamping. Reuter held onto the person next to her. The boat was drifting away from the sinking ship. Around them, people were floating in the water, some alive, some already dead. At 9:40, the Wilhelm Gustloff rolled completely onto its port side. The starboard side of the hull was now horizontal, pointing skyward. People were standing on the ship's side, clinging to anything bolted down. Then the stern began to lift. The bow was completely submerged. The ship was now vertical in the water, bow pointing down, stern pointing up. People on the ship's side slid down toward the water. They could not stop their slide. They went into the Baltic and disappeared. At 9:48, 40 minutes after the first torpedo strike, the Wilhelm Gustloff disappeared beneath the surface. The ship did not sink slowly. It went down fast. The stern rose higher, then suddenly slipped beneath the waves. The suction created by the sinking vessel pulled everything nearby underwater. People floating on the surface were dragged down. Debris was pulled under. The ocean's surface churned and bubbled. Then it went still. The ship was gone. Where the Wilhelm Gustloff had been, there was now only dark water and floating debris, and thousands of people dying in the cold. The Löwe moved through the debris field, picking up survivors. The crew threw lines into the water. They pulled people aboard. They worked fast. Every minute mattered. People in the water were dying from hypothermia. The Löwe's crew pulled aboard anyone they could reach. Within 30 minutes, the Löwe had rescued approximately 472 people. The ship could hold no more. The Löwe turned toward the nearest port, Kolberg, approximately 60 nautical miles away. The rescued survivors were packed into every available space. Most were suffering from hypothermia. Many would not survive the voyage even after rescue. Other German vessels responded to the Wilhelm Gustloff's distress signals. The torpedo boat T-36 arrived at approximately midnight and began searching for survivors. The minesweeper M387 arrived shortly after. The torpedo boat TF-19 arrived at approximately 0100 hours. These vessels picked up survivors from lifeboats and from the water, but they arrived too late for most. By the time rescue vessels reached the scene, the vast majority of people who had been aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff were already dead. The cold water killed them. Hypothermia stops the heart within minutes. Of the approximately 10,500 people aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff when it sailed from Gotenhafen, approximately 1,239 survived. The dead numbered approximately 9,261. This made the Wilhelm Gustloff the deadliest maritime disaster in human history, killing 6 times more people than the Titanic. Helga Reuter survived because she was in one of the few lifeboats that launched successfully. The lifeboat drifted in the darkness for approximately 2 hours before being spotted by the torpedo boat T-36. By the time rescue arrived, half the people in the lifeboat were dead from hypothermia. Reuter was unconscious, but alive. The crew of T-36 pulled her aboard and wrapped her in blankets. She woke hours later in a hospital in Kolberg, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. She would lose 3 toes from frostbite. But she survived. Most of her friends and colleagues from the Women's Naval Auxiliary did not. Of the 370 female auxiliaries who had been aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, fewer than 40 survived. The Soviet submarine S-13 did not stay to observe the results of the attack. Standard procedure for submarines after firing torpedoes was to dive deep and leave the area immediately. Remaining on the surface made the submarine vulnerable to counterattack from escort vessels. Marinesco heard the explosions through the submarine's hydrophones. He knew the torpedoes had hit. He heard the sounds of a ship breaking apart and sinking. But he did not know what kind of ship it was, or how many people were aboard. He recorded in his log that S-13 had attacked and sunk a large German transport on the evening of January 30th. He estimated the target at approximately 25,000 tons, based on the size of the vessel as seen through the periscope. He did not know the target was a passenger liner carrying over 10,000 refugees. S-13 departed the area and continued its patrol. 10 days later, the submarine attacked and sank another German transport, the General von Steuben, killing approximately 3,000 more people. Marinesco returned to base in Finland in February and reported his successes. He had sunk 2 large German vessels. Soviet Naval Command was pleased. Marinesco was recommended for the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, the highest Soviet military decoration. But Soviet intelligence soon learned details about the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking from German radio broadcasts and refugee accounts. The ship had been carrying mostly civilians, women and children. The casualties were enormous, over 9,000 dead. Soviet propaganda could not celebrate this victory publicly because it raised uncomfortable questions about targeting civilian refugees. The story was quietly buried. Marinesco was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, but not Hero of the Soviet Union. His later career was troubled. He was dismissed from the Navy in 1945 for continued disciplinary problems. He worked in obscurity for decades as a factory manager in Leningrad. In 1963, the Soviet Navy reconsidered his case and retroactively awarded him Hero of the Soviet Union, recognizing his combat effectiveness despite his personal flaws. Marinesco died in 1963, the same year he received the award, never having spoken publicly about the Wilhelm Gustloff. German authorities attempted to keep the sinking secret. German civilians were already demoralized by the war. News that over 9,000 refugees had died in one disaster would devastate public morale. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine, ordered that information about the Wilhelm Gustloff be classified. Only senior military officials were informed of the casualty numbers. The families of victims were told simply that their relatives had died during evacuation operations. No details were provided. No public announcement was made. In the chaos of Germany's collapse in early 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster was simply one more tragedy in a war full of tragedies. After the war ended, the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking slowly became known through survivor accounts and captured German documents. Researchers compiled casualty estimates based on partial manifests and survivor testimony. The numbers varied. Some estimates placed the death toll as low as 7,000. Others suggested over 9,500. The consensus settled on approximately 9,200 dead, making it by far the deadliest maritime disaster in history. Yet the Wilhelm Gustloff remained obscure outside Germany. The disaster occurred during the final chaotic months of the war. Germany was losing. The world had little sympathy for German casualties. The Holocaust was being discovered. Concentration camps were being liberated. German atrocities were being documented. In that context, 9,000 dead Germans on a sinking ship seemed like rough justice rather than tragedy. The wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff lies in approximately 150 feet of water, approximately 18 nautical miles off the coast of Poland, near the town of Leba. The ship is broken into several sections. The forward section where the torpedo struck is separated from the midsection. The stern section is relatively intact. Polish authorities have declared the wreck a war grave and prohibited unauthorized diving. The site has been explored by technical divers and by remotely operated vehicles multiple times over the decades. The divers report that the wreck is heavily silted. The interior compartments are filled with sediment. Human remains are still present, though largely decomposed. Personal effects are scattered throughout the wreck. Suitcases, clothing, toys. The physical evidence of 9,000 lives ended in 40 minutes. The technical analysis of the sinking reveals how little time the passengers had. The first torpedo struck at 9:16. The ship capsized at 9:48. The total time from attack to sinking was 32 minutes. In that 32 minutes, the crew needed to organize the evacuation of over 10,000 people from a ship that was listing without power, in darkness, with insufficient lifeboats. The task was impossible. Even with perfect organization and adequate equipment, evacuating that many people in 30 minutes would have been nearly impossible. With panic, darkness, and inadequate equipment, it was hopeless. The mathematics were brutal. 9 lifeboats successfully launched, each boat holding approximately 100 people. That accounts for 900 people. Approximately 400 more were pulled from the water by rescue vessels. That totals 1,300 survivors. Everyone else died. Over 9,000 people. Most drowned. Some were crushed in the crowds. Some were killed by the explosions. But most simply froze to death in the Baltic Sea. The water was cold enough to kill in 15 minutes. By the time rescue vessels arrived, most people in the water were already dead. The children who survived the Wilhelm Gustloff carried psychological trauma for their entire lives. A girl who was 5 years old during the sinking later reported that she remembered her mother pushing her into a lifeboat, but not boarding herself. The girl watched her mother disappear into the crowd on the sinking ship. She never saw her mother again. A boy who was 7 clung to debris in the water for over 2 hours before being rescued. He lost his entire family. Both parents and 2 siblings drowned. He was pulled from the water unconscious and nearly dead from hypothermia. He survived but suffered permanent nerve damage in his hands and feet from frostbite. A teenage girl survived by clinging to an overturned lifeboat with approximately 20 other people. One by one, the others died from hypothermia and slipped off the boat. She was the only one still holding on when a rescue vessel arrived 6 hours after the sinking. She later said that the worst part was not the cold, but listening to people die around her. Hearing them stop talking, stop moving, stop breathing, and knowing she could do nothing to help them. The impact of the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster on Operation Hannibal was minimal. The evacuation continued. Hundreds of ships continued moving refugees westward through February, March, and April of 1945. Additional ships were sunk. The Goya was torpedoed on April 16th, with over 6,000 people aboard. The casualty count was over 6,000. The General von Steuben was sunk on February 10th, with over 3,000 dead. The Deutschland was bombed and sunk in May, with approximately 1,000 dead. But despite these losses, Operation Hannibal successfully evacuated over 2 million people before the war ended. The Wilhelm Gustloff accounted for nearly half the deaths during the evacuation, but represented only a tiny fraction of the people moved. The evacuation as a whole was a remarkable success, despite the terrible casualties. The question of whether the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking was a war crime has been debated for decades. International maritime law theoretically required submarines to surface, warn passenger vessels, and allow evacuation before attacking. But total war had rendered these rules meaningless years earlier. German U-boats had not warned Allied ships before attacking. Germany had torpedoed passenger liners throughout the war without warning. The Athenia was sunk on the first day of the war in September 1939, with over 100 deaths. Germany showed no restraint targeting civilian shipping. Soviet forces showed equal lack of restraint. The Wilhelm Gustloff was painted in military colors. It was carrying military personnel, including wounded soldiers and submarine trainees. It was broadcasting on military radio frequencies. From a submarine commander's perspective, underwater with no ability to see details clearly, it appeared to be a military transport. Marinesco followed his orders and attacked what appeared to be a legitimate target. The fact that the target was carrying thousands of civilians was not something he could have known from his attack position. Legally, under the rules of total war that governed operations in 1945, the attack was justified. Morally, the result was a catastrophe. Both things can be true simultaneously. After the war, the Wilhelm Gustloff survivors formed associations to maintain contact and share memories. Annual memorial services were held in Germany to commemorate the disaster. Survivors gave testimony to researchers documenting the sinking. Books were published. Documentaries were made. But the story remained largely unknown internationally. In Germany, the Wilhelm Gustloff became part of the larger narrative of German suffering during the war. Germans had suffered terribly in the war's final months. Cities were destroyed by bombing. Millions of refugees fled westward. Hundreds of thousands died during the evacuations. The Wilhelm Gustloff was simply the single worst disaster in that larger catastrophe. German commemoration of the sinking emphasized the civilian nature of the victims and the tragedy of children dying. These were innocent casualties of war, not military combatants. But this framing was complicated by context. The refugees aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff were fleeing the consequences of Germany's war of aggression against the Soviet Union. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. German forces had killed millions of Soviet civilians. German policies in occupied territories had been brutal. The siege of Leningrad alone killed over 1 million Soviet civilians through starvation. Soviet forces advancing into German territory in early 1945 were seeking revenge. The refugees aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff were not personally responsible for German atrocities. Most were women and children, but they were Germans fleeing Soviet forces, whose brutality was itself a response to German brutality. This does not justify the Wilhelm Gustloff's sinking. 9,000 dead civilians is a tragedy regardless of context. But the context explains why the world did not particularly care. Germany had spent 6 years making the world hate Germany. By January 1945, sympathy for German suffering was limited. The technical lessons learned from the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster influenced post-war maritime safety regulations. The International Maritime Organization, established in 1948, developed new rules requiring passenger vessels to carry sufficient lifeboats for all passengers, conduct regular evacuation drills, maintain watertight compartments that could contain flooding, and ensure adequate emergency power systems. These regulations were developed specifically in response to disasters like the Wilhelm Gustloff, where inadequate safety equipment and poor emergency procedures contributed to massive casualties. Modern passenger ships are required to have lifeboat capacity for 120% of maximum passenger load. They must conduct evacuation drills within 24 hours of departure. They must have backup power systems that activate automatically if main power fails. They must have emergency lighting throughout the ship. These requirements are the direct result of lessons learned from the Wilhelm Gustloff and similar disasters. The strategic impact of the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking was negligible. The war continued. Operation Hannibal continued. The evacuation of refugees continued. The death of 9,000 people did not change any strategic calculus. It did not affect military operations. It did not influence political decisions. It simply killed 9,000 people and traumatized 1,000 survivors. In the context of World War II, which killed over 60 million people, 9,000 more casualties barely registered. That is perhaps the most depressing aspect of the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster. It was the deadliest maritime disaster in history, and in the context of the war, it was just another footnote. Helga Reuter survived the Wilhelm Gustloff, but carried the trauma for the rest of her life. She was hospitalized for 3 weeks, recovering from hypothermia and frostbite. She lost 3 toes. She suffered nerve damage in her hands. But she was alive. After recovering, she was assigned to administrative duties in Western Germany for the remainder of the war. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, she returned to civilian life. She never returned to East Prussia. Her family home was now part of Poland. She settled in West Germany, married in 1948, had 2 children, and lived a quiet life. She rarely spoke about the Wilhelm Gustloff. The memories were too painful. When her children asked what happened to her toes, she said it was frostbite from the war and changed the subject. Only in her 70s did she begin speaking to researchers about her experience. She gave interviews. She attended survivor gatherings. She wanted the story told before all the survivors died. Reuter died in 2008 at age 87. She was one of the last survivors of the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster. The Wilhelm Gustloff's bell was recovered from the wreck by Polish divers in 2003 and is now displayed in a museum in Gdansk. The bell is bronze, weighs approximately 40 pounds, and is engraved with the ship's name and launch date. When the ship was sinking, this bell would have been ringing continuously, alerting crew and passengers to the emergency. The bell rang as the ship capsized. It rang as 9,000 people died. Now, it sits silent in a museum case, a relic from the worst maritime disaster in history. Visitors see it and read the placard explaining its significance. Most know nothing about the Wilhelm Gustloff. The Titanic is world famous. The Wilhelm Gustloff is obscure. The difference is not the magnitude of the tragedy. The Wilhelm Gustloff killed 6 times more people. The difference is timing and context. The Titanic sank in peacetime and became a symbol of hubris and tragedy. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank during a war and became a footnote. That difference says something about how humans process tragedy. We remember peacetime disasters because they seem preventable and shocking. We forget wartime disasters because they seem inevitable and expected. 9,000 people freezing to death in the Baltic Sea should be shocking. But in the context of World War II, it was just another day's casualties. The Soviet archives contain Marinesco's patrol reports from January and February 1945. The reports are clinical and technical. They describe the attack on the Wilhelm Gustloff in dry military language. Target identified. Firing solution calculated. 3 torpedoes fired. 3 explosions heard. Target sinking sounds confirmed. Submarine departed area. No mention of casualties. No mention of refugees. No moral reflection. Just the mechanics of a successful submarine attack. Marinesco did not know and probably did not care how many people died. His job was to sink German ships. He sank 1. Mission accomplished. This detachment is how submarine warfare worked. You fire torpedoes at sonar contacts. You hear explosions. You do not see the people dying. You do not hear the screaming. You just hear machinery noise and water sounds through hydrophones. The distance and technology insulated attackers from the humanity of their targets. If Marinesco had seen 9,000 people drowning, would he have attacked differently? Probably not. By January 1945, Soviet forces had witnessed 4 years of German brutality. Mercy and restraint had been eliminated. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a German ship. Germans were the enemy. Attacking it was legitimate. The casualties were irrelevant. This calculus reveals the moral bankruptcy of total war. When every target is legitimate, when civilian casualties are acceptable, when revenge is policy, atrocities become routine. The Wilhelm Gustloff sinking was an atrocity. 9,000 civilians, mostly women and children, died. But it was a legal atrocity, conducted according to the rules of total war, that both sides had agreed to follow by abandoning traditional restraints. Germany had abandoned those restraints when it bombed Warsaw, Rotterdam, Coventry, and countless Soviet cities. The Soviet Union abandoned them in response. By January 1945, there were no rules. There was only killing. The Wilhelm Gustloff was simply 9,000 more casualties in a war that had already killed 60 million. The final accounting of the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster took decades to compile. Researchers cross-referenced German naval records, survivor testimony, and Soviet archives to establish casualty estimates. The numbers remain imprecise because the ship's manifest was incomplete. Many refugees boarded without being recorded. Many wounded soldiers had no documentation. The submarine trainees were counted, but many civilian passengers were not. The best estimate based on available evidence is that approximately 10,500 people were aboard when the Wilhelm Gustloff departed Gotenhafen. Approximately 1,239 survived. Approximately 9,261 died. This makes the Wilhelm Gustloff the deadliest single-ship maritime disaster in history, killing more people than the Titanic, Lusitania, Empress of Ireland, General Slocum, and Mont Blanc combined. Yet, despite this terrible distinction, the Wilhelm Gustloff remains largely unknown. Most people have never heard of it. Maritime disaster lists mention it, but provide little detail. History books covering World War II rarely discuss it. The disaster has not been memorialized in major films or literature outside Germany. The ship's name is not recognized. The scale of the tragedy is not appreciated. The 9,000 dead are forgotten. This forgetting reveals something uncomfortable about how we remember history. We remember what serves our narratives. The Titanic serves a narrative about hubris and the limits of technology. The Wilhelm Gustloff serves no clear narrative. Germans cannot easily memorialize it without acknowledging the context of German aggression that created the disaster. Others cannot easily memorialize it without appearing to sympathize with German casualties. So it is forgotten. 9,000 people died in 40 minutes in the Baltic Sea on January 30th, 1945. Most people do not know. Most people do not care. The victims are buried in an unmarked grave 150 feet underwater, and the world has moved on. But for the survivors, the Wilhelm Gustloff never ended. Helga Reuter woke from nightmares about drowning for decades after the war. She heard screaming in quiet moments. She felt cold even in warm weather. The trauma was permanent. Other survivors reported similar experiences. 60 years after the sinking, survivors still gathered annually to remember. They shared stories. They honored the dead. They tried to keep the memory alive even as the world forgot. By 2015, only a handful of survivors remained alive. By 2020, most were gone. By 2025, the last survivors are in their 90s. Within a decade, there will be no living survivors. The Wilhelm Gustloff will transition completely from lived experience to history. And history, as the Wilhelm Gustloff demonstrates, is a selective memory. We remember what we choose to remember. We forget what is inconvenient or complicated or uncomfortable. 9,000 dead in the Baltic Sea is all three. At 2:15 in the afternoon on January 30th, 1945, Helga Reuter stepped onto the gangway and boarded the Wilhelm Gustloff. 7 hours later, she was in a lifeboat watching the ship disappear beneath the waves. 9,000 people died around her in the darkness and cold. She survived by chance. No skill, no heroism, just chance. She was in the right place when the lifeboats launched. She was strong enough to hold on. She was young enough to survive hypothermia. That is all. Thousands of others equally deserving of life died because they were in the wrong compartment, or could not reach the stairs, or fell into the water without a life jacket. The survivors carry guilt for surviving while others died. This is not rational. They did nothing wrong. But guilt does not require rationality. Helga Reuter survived the Wilhelm Gustloff and spent 63 more years wondering why she lived while 9,000 others died. The question has no answer. There is only the fact. On January 30th, 1945, in the Baltic Sea, in the darkness and cold, 9,000 people died in 40 minutes because a submarine fired 3 torpedoes at a ship. That is what happened. That is the Wilhelm Gustloff.